We'll be getting started in a few minutes here as people start to trickle in.
All right.
But for the folks that are on the line, why don't you tell us where you're from in the chat?
I'm going to go close the curtain to my office really quick so nobody comes in here.
No worries.
Oh, wow. Madrid.
Madrid. What time is it in Madrid?
That's funny. That's exactly what I was wondering.
10 p.m. Wow. We better make this a good conversation, Srini.
No pressure at all.
No pressure. And it's still hot out. Sounds nice. I'm actually dialing in from Hawaii. Not normally where I live. Normally in Vancouver, which is not super hot, but it's like 90 degrees in Hawaii this week, and I have zero complaints.
Nice. Yeah, I know we sent out a notice to our email list this morning as well. So.
Yeah, let's give it a few more minutes.
Not a problem. And there'll be a recording of this as well, right, for people to be able to view?
Yep, absolutely. While we're waiting, Srini, are you interviewing any cool guests this week for your podcast?
I have interviewed, I think 3. Let's see, I did 1 interview today, 1 yesterday, 1 tomorrow. Who did I interview today? Actually, no, tomorrow might be the day off this week, finally. So yesterday, I interviewed Luke Burgess, who just wrote a new book called Wanting, which is all about how sort of social influences and the world around us influences the things that we desire, and also distorts, value systems. Really fascinating. I mean, he was probably one of my favorite interviews, really thought-provoking. Let's see, in the last few weeks, I'm trying to think, the episode that we just aired recently is probably my favorite episode of the year. It's one with a woman named Leslie M. She wrote a book called Swagger, and she did such a good job writing that, because I mean, so many people have tried to cover that subject, and she did a phenomenal job, not only making it inspirational and practical, but backing up with a lot of not just a bunch of anecdotal evidence, but concrete evidence, which is something I tend to look for in people I interview. Because that's a problem with self-help in general, right? Is it's easy to sort of write a lot of intellectual BS that is based entirely on anecdotal evidence, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I feel like I can't take it seriously until someone gives me a little bit of that, well, we did do some research and there's some scientific backing to this. That's just also how my brain works.
And even, my roommate and I joked, in any social science book, we're like, okay, how many times are we going to use the example of the London cab drivers? Can you guys, you're doing research on this, how about finding some other example?
Yeah, totally. Agreed. All right, why don't we get started, and people are going to trickle in as they trickle in. We have an awesome webinar for you this morning, or afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. We're going to be talking about the 5 pillars for building a scalable content business. I'm Sandy Manga. I am VP Growth and Marketing at Charli AI, and I'll be hosting this kind of fireside chat today with our special guest. Before I introduce our special guest, I'm going to talk a little bit about Charli AI, just a little self-serving plug here. Charli is a revolutionary new way to control content chaos. Charli is a unified workspace for all of your cloud content and apps that power the work that you do every day. And we're helping busy content creators, freelancers, and small teams find the content that they need, share it, and manage it all in one place so that you can really make sense of the mess. And the way that we do that is through our powerful AI, which helps you in categorizing all of that information and making it available at your fingertips. And we actually just launched a brand new user interface and a new look and feel. So if you're interested, definitely check it out. Also, before I introduce our special guest, I wanted to get some housekeeping items out of the way. We are recording this webinar today, and I will be sharing that recording once it becomes available. You can ask us questions, or more specifically, you can ask Srini, our special guest, questions in the Q&A chat box throughout, and we'll reserve about 10 minutes at the end of this webinar to get to those questions. So just keep them coming, and I will keep an eye on them. And also, we'd love to do more fireside chats in the future. So if you enjoy the conversation, let us know who you want us to talk to next. You can also drop that in the Q&A or drop it in the chat here. So without further ado, I am super excited to have our guest on today. We're joined by Srinivas Rao, host of Unmistakable Creative Podcast and the CEO of Unmistakable Media. He's got so many accolades that I could probably spend a lot of time going through all of them. But the thing that I want to highlight the most is Srini has spent the better part of the last decade perfecting how to be the most productive, best version of himself and bring that best version to his businesses, and how he turned a lot of his passions into this flourishing business. And that's what he's going to share with us today. And he's going to go through his journey from hating his 9-to-5 to becoming a published author and building this scalable media business. Srini has also just been a wealth of knowledge for me and the team here at Charli AI, because he's an expert on productivity, and he's just had amazing insights that he's helped us improve the product. Full disclosure, Srini is also an advisor to our company, but I would definitely know that's not because he loves the product, not because he's biased, but because he actually gets value out of it. And I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, Srini.
No, no, not at all.
So let's jump into it.
I mean, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so Srini, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how the Unmistakable Creative came to be? And yes, you can totally share a little bit about how you became to be our advisor as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think some of these people are already in my audience, so I don't want to beat a dead horse. So, I want to make sure that we focus on providing value for them than talking about myself. But, I have sort of story of a life plan that just went wrong. I graduated from business school April 2009, thinking that I would have some sort of normal job. Of course, 2009 was a terrible time to graduate from school. And the best piece of advice I ever got during that summer was from a consultant when I'd started my blog, who said, the worst thing that you could do when you're unemployed is to spend all of your time looking for a job, which is incredibly counterintuitive. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but now looking back, I realized how true that was, because if you spend all your time looking for a job, you're focused on the one thing that's wrong with your life. And so he said, do something. And so I started a blog that, and a part of that was taking an online course, which eventually led to me interviewing people as part of that course, which subsequently became, the first version of the podcast, which was a podcast for bloggers called Podcast FM, where I just interviewed up and coming bloggers. I had a day job at that time, and I ended up getting let go from that job in 2011. And what ended up happening after that was me just sort of cobbling together a bunch of freelance projects until I had a mentor who came along and really, helped me narrow it down what I wanted to do. He asked me probably what I think is one of the most important questions anybody asked me. He said, do you want to be doing any of this in 5 years? And most of the answer to it was no, because I was freelance writing, book marketing, social media manager, and I narrowed it down to the podcast and writing books. And in the next year or so, things really started to turn around. I self-published a book that became a Wall Street Journal bestseller through the series of freakish coincidences. And that eventually led to a book deal, which, eventually led to the rebrand of the podcast as Unmistakable Creative. And God, how many years ago was that? That was 2014. So 8 years later, here we are, having built the Unmistakable Creative. And then how I became an advisor to Charli was Sandy emailed me about the product. And, my, gut reaction was to follow the Mark Cuban rule of I don't attend meetings unless somebody's writing me a check. But I actually, went and looked at the product first. And I told Sandy, I was like, wow, I really like this product. And that kind of became sort of my rule of if I was going to work with a startup, I wanted to make sure that I actually liked the product and used it. And I actually do use Charli to store all my documents now. If you've ever run into that problem of sifting through your hard drive for, something like an insurance policy your health insurance record or tax returns. This solves that problem. And as somebody who deals with the sheer volume of information that I do, it's a godsend. Like now I don't, when my accountant asks me for something, I'm like, oh, just pop it open in Charli. So I tend to save a lot of things there. That has been really, particularly documents and PDFs. I still have stuff on my computer when it's media related, but I have found it to be really one of those great things because we come across so much information throughout the day, and half of it we don't even remember. And so when I want to remember something, or a link that I want to save, I always keep it in Charli. But yeah, so that's the short version of a ridiculously long story.
Yeah. The long version is probably best over a beer, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly.
So we are going to get back to the kind of topic of information overload, especially as it impacts content creators and some of the tools that you personally use to help combat that in your business. But for now, I wanted to actually ask you a question about your book, so Unmistakable, Why Only is Better Than Best. You talk about some of these exact qualities that you believe help in unlocking that long-term success. So could you tell me a little bit more about that and how you came up with this idea of being unmistakable?
Yeah, I think that the real important lesson here is that I hear a lot of people talk about finding purpose, finding mission. People come across Simon Sinek's Find Your Why, and they want to sit down in an afternoon and figure out their life's purpose and whatever the mission and message of their work is. But I realize that that is something that gets revealed through the work that you do, which is really the important lesson here. So as I mentioned, I started out interviewing bloggers about how they grew their blogs, and eventually I got really bored of it. But there was a pattern that I just noticed over and over and over, to the point at which it just started to drive me a little insane. And my friend Tara McMullen says, she's like, if there's great creative potential in the things that make you angry. And the thing that made me so angry was that I would see somebody who would take an online course from some expert or influencer, and then they would follow that person's instructions to the letter. They would make a website that looked exactly like that person's, try to create content that looked exactly like theirs or sound like theirs, and just literally to the letter try to basically be that person, ignoring the blatantly obvious variable that would make sure that that advice actually didn't work, and that's themselves. And you see this over and over and over. It's not just individuals who do this, businesses do this, but in businesses, you call it best practices. And so as a result, particularly in a sea of noise, you just get washed up in a sea of sameness, and you don't have any original ideas. So people actually hold back on the very things that would make them stand out. And part of that is also just conditioning. I didn't get to write about this in the book because my thinking has evolved quite a bit, because I wrote that book in 2016, I think. If I remember correctly, it was published in 2016. So it's been 6 years since I wrote that book. And that's kind of the way books are, right? You go back and you're like, oh, I have a different opinion about what I just said now. But the core idea still is true. And the person who really deserves credit for it is not me. My friend Mars Dorian, who does a lot of the artwork on our site, not the album covers, but sort of the logos and the branding. He really was the one who came up with the visual voice of the brand. And he said something to me in a conversation that always stayed with me. He said that I want my work to be so recognizable that I don't even have to put my name on it, and you'll know it's mine. And if you know my friend Mars, if anything that he does rolls through your newsfeed, from taking one look at it, there's nobody else that could do that. And it's not that the style is, particularly, it's not like he has some sort of really detailed artistic talent. It's just distinctive. He is incredibly talented, but there's something about the signature that he puts on it that you just look at it and you're like, wow, he doesn't have to sign his name to this. I know it's his, even if he does it for me or if he does it for anybody else. And what I realized is that if somebody has that capability, their competition is irrelevant. So when I need something that is done in that style, there's literally nobody else that can do that. They might be able to kind of copy it or mimic it, but he's the one person. And not only that, I know that if I go to him, he will create something that really stands out. Just to give you an example, I taught a workshop at Citibank a few years ago on productivity. And I remember the night before, I was at a shopping center and I was looking at these posters for Citibank bank accounts. And I thought to myself, the only reason I noticed this poster is because I'm speaking at Citibank tomorrow. Otherwise, I would have completely ignored this. Now, if that had been like a Banksy style poster, the Mars Dorian cover was provocative and crazy and edgy, that would have caught my attention. Of course, there are a lot of people who won't compromise a 200-year-old brand because it's like, oh, this is our logo, this is our brand. And that's why nobody pays attention to all these ads that you spend billions of dollars on. And so that's really kind of the genesis of the idea. And I thought, as the world becomes noisier, standing out in a sea of noise is no longer just a matter of success, it's a matter of survival. And this is true whether you're a creative with a business or somebody who's applying to a day job. Your resume has to stand out in the pile of thousands the recruiter gets. I mean, even you and I talking, like there had to be something about me that stood out for me to say, okay, for me to like be worthy enough to be an advisor to you guys. And so that's kind of where the whole genesis of it is. And the thing that I think is challenging with this is that people want the formula, right? Like, okay, give me the 6 steps to be unmistakable. And if I did that, then you wouldn't be unmistakable.
Yeah, no, exactly. So although there aren't the exact formulas on how to be quote unmistakable, but there are, like, I think you describe more like formulaic ways to start thinking about your life so that you can
Yeah,
uncover how to be unmistakable.
yeah,
And I kind of noticed that in our conversations too, like, and this is kind of like the dichotomy of you is you are this like creative thinker, but you also think about things in more of a methodical way than one would
mhm,
assume. So I'm wondering, like, why was that important for you to uncover? And was that like a skill that you had to learn to
yeah.
start thinking in this formulaic way about certain things, or were you always this way?
No, I definitely wasn't always this way. I mean, part of it, yeah, I got terrible grades in college. I was a horrible employee at every place that I worked at, which is why I don't think I could ever have a job. But a big part of it is that I knew that if I wanted to be consistent and prolific with my work, systems were going to play a role. And a lot of creative people resist systems because systems create structure, and people think that structure is an impediment to their creativity, but it's actually not. It basically frees you up to be more creative because now you're not worrying about how to manage your work, how to do all these things. You can focus exclusively on the work by building out systems that free up your cognitive bandwidth. And we have systems for everything, right? From capturing content, capturing ideas, to creating content, to whatever it is. But the funny thing is, when people hear systems, they start to you kind of think about technology. But everybody has systems in their life. They just don't call them that. If you put key hooks in a certain place in your house, you have a system. If you have auto pay for any of your bills, you have a system. And so what I've done is I've just taken that and I applied it to creative work, which is, I think, where all this becomes really interesting. Give me just a second. I got to plug in my power so that I don't have my laptop die.
No
Okay,
worries.
cool.
And actually, that's a good segue into what I wanted to talk about next, which is some of the challenges for creatives, content creators, and kind of general like entrepreneurs in this creative space. What were some of the challenges that you specifically faced early on when you were trying to turn your creativity into this business and channel it and apply these systems and formulas?
Yeah, I think the big challenge, and this is something I think that's common, is that there's so much information and a lot of it is conflicting, trying to figure out what's worth listening to, what's not worth listening to, who do you listen to, what's valid, what's not. And I think the really important thing here is that context matters, right? The same advice that works for me is probably not appropriate for, a mother with 2 infants, which I have a mother with 2 infants in my community, and she comes to our calls sometimes with a baby in tow. And my productivity advice of 1 focused hour a day is nonsense for somebody like that. And so I think that was one of the things that really made me want to understand this is that, okay, the big challenge was that I was doing a lot of work. I was never somebody who didn't work hard, but for some reason, the results weren't there. I was struggling to grow a blog. I thought to myself, I'm doing what you're supposed to do, publishing frequently, all that stuff. And I realized that what that does to you is that it puts your focus on outcomes as opposed to focus on the process. And when you're focused on outcomes, one, it's incredibly demotivating because until you achieve the outcome, you feel like a failure. 2, you're trying to focus on something that's completely out of your control. So I have writers who will occasionally come to me and say, "Oh, I want to write a book that sells 1 million copies," and I say, "Well, I can't help you with that, one, because I've never written a book that sells 1 million copies, and 2, that's a ridiculous goal because you can't predict if your book will sell 1 million copies. So until this person sells 1 million copies of a book, they feel like a failure." And so that was a big challenge for me, was to learn how to stop thinking about outcomes and to start focusing on process, because ultimately you get rewarded for outcomes. But the funny thing is that the way you achieve outcomes is through process. And so that actually ended up becoming the bulk of what the second book ended up being about, was the process behind how I do all of this work. And even that second book now is incomplete because we didn't do a section on systems, as at least as detailed as they've become now. Part of it is the tools now are far more sophisticated and they've evolved. In 4 years, the progress has been dramatic. So, I mean, in an ideal world, you're going to have systems that handle a lot of the grunt work for you. And we're going to see a point at which technical proficiency is going to matter a lot less than your ability to imagine what is possible with a particular tool or a particular piece of technology. And I think the two questions that I think that I tend to ask, and I got to give credit where credit is due. My mentor, Greg, he would go around the country and, he'd meet with people, work with them one-on-one. And this is 2008 or 2009, keep in mind. And as ridiculous as the question was, he would say, do you know how to use the internet? And of course, people were like, of course I know how to use the internet. And then he would say, great, show me something that you've made using the internet. And that was one of those things that I realized was really powerful, because I say, like, I don't, podcasting is one expression of what I do. But when I look at technology, the first question I ask is, what could I make using this? And the second question, and this comes from Julian Smith, who had one of the most popular blogs on the internet, then went on to found a startup called Breather. And his default question, and this is really, this question has led to billions of dollars in value. And it's kind of amazing because people unconsciously ask this question. They don't realize they do when they're starting these companies. And that's what's possible now that wasn't before. So, Charli is possible now. It wouldn't have been possible 5 or 6 years ago because we just didn't have the technological capabilities. And so throughout, every 10 years or so, you see these paradigm shifts, right? Where you have intersections of multiple technologies. So in the early 90s, we had the intersection of the ability to process a credit card and a commercial web browser, which, for those who don't know, was a contribution of the porn industry, if you've never seen the movie Middleman. But they made it possible for us to have Amazon, eBay, and e-commerce as we know it today. The ability to combine a web browser and the ability to take a payment fundamentally changed the entire landscape of our economy. And then you get to 2008, where you get the iPhone and location tracking, and think about all the companies that have been enabled by those two convergences of technologies. And so that's kind of where my thinking is kind of come from. And so bit by bit, as this happens and the world gets faster and faster, you start to just become somebody who thinks in systems. And no, it's kind of an odd paradox, because people have pointed out, they're like, you're this creative person, but you're highly productive as well. And the two usually seem like they don't go hand in hand. And that's the thing I think most creatives fail to realize, is that structure actually, facilitates creativity. It doesn't inhibit it.
Mm-hmm. And, based on our conversations and what you've seen in your community, it sounds like a lot of people do struggle with that kind of understanding. And do you have any specifics you can speak to that you've seen creatives in your community, as well as yourself, struggling with when it comes to creating the process, building the business, making it scalable?
Yeah, I think the first place to start really is to think about this from the standpoint of idea capture, right? Nobody has a shortage of ideas. Saying you have a shortage of ideas is like saying you have a shortage of thoughts. That's ridiculous. But the problem is we don't have the discipline to capture our ideas. And to capture ideas and to create that discipline, you need systems. So simple example, let's say that you start a blog, right? People think, oh, what am I going to write in my blog? What am I going to publish this week? You wake up in the morning. The problem with that is that it's not that you have a shortage of ideas of what to write about. You just didn't capture those ideas. So you're always starting from scratch. And the simplest version of this that I can offer, and obviously it gets more and more sophisticated as you use it more, you start to figure out, tags and deadlines and topics and all sorts of stuff. But the simplest version of it is, here's an idea that I'm going to write about. Or, another really simple dumbed down version of this is something Stephen Johnson wrote about called the Spark file, which is literally just a piece of paper, a Google Doc with thoughts, and the only structure to it is that it's organized chronologically. And then he goes through it, at the end of every week. And, those are the kinds of things that allow people to do things like write books, start companies. It's basically like this just endless pile of napkins where you're just writing things down, except it's all accessible to you because it's in digital form. And I think that that's where people often go wrong, is they don't have a habit of capturing ideas, thoughts. And even when we make to-do lists, we kind of just wake up in the morning and fly by the seat of our pants without thinking about why we're doing the things we're doing, whether they're contributing to what we're actually trying to accomplish. Because it's really easy to get a lot done and accomplish nothing. If you spend all day, it's like, yeah, I cleared my inbox, I updated my social media feed, I updated my bio on Twitter, and guess what? None of that has done anything to move my project forward. I think that's where people get tripped up, is they try to do too much in one day. And I'm going through this book right now, Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Berkman, who wrote another book called The Antidote: Positive Thinking for People Who Hate Positive Thinking. So he's a very contrarian author, and I like his viewpoints a lot. And I think we have this sort of delusional idea that there's going to be a day when we can get every single thing done, and we're going to be in this Zen-like state of productivity, but that's just not feasible. It's not realistic. And so I think that we have to make peace with this whole idea of getting enough done in a given day, enough that we feel we're going to be able to keep moving things forward. The other thing that happens here is when you have systems, you end up having visible progress, which is like a huge motivator. Teresa Amabile at Harvard wrote a book about this called The Progress Principle. And this takes us back to process versus outcome. So let's just use the book example, because that's the one I'm familiar with and the one we brought up before. So if we say this person's like, oh, I'm going to write a book that sells 1 million copies. Well, until that person sells 1 million copies, it's going to feel like they're not making any progress, even if they're writing every day. Whereas if they track their word count and see every day that this thing is moving forward, they end up staying motivated to accomplish the goal. So systems have this sort of interdependent effect. They're not just for managing your time or being more productive. They actually have almost a psychological effect to give you this sense of progress and increase your motivation, which is really key.
So when did you realize, and like what was the thing that you started to think about first when you were trying to scale your creativity, scale your business? Like, how did you notice where the blockages were, and then what did you do in order to kind of like unblock yourself in that way?
Yeah, I'm by no means perfect at this. Even yesterday, I was talking to our new marketing and community manager, and she has been basically saying we need to get you out of being so involved in the business. There's a certain point at which you realize that if you're doing everything yourself, there's going to be a limit to what you can accomplish. And I think that when I started writing my book, the thing that became very apparent to me was there are two things. Actually, the big one was that I planned a conference. That's when I realized that planning and systems really had to be part of it, because we brought in an event manager, and when I saw what was actually involved, I realized, okay, paying her was really smart. At first, I thought to myself, do we want to pay an event manager? Then when I saw what was actually involved in the logistics, from going to venues to talking to vendors to, like trying food, all stuff that I find mind-numbing. It's like planning a wedding with no wife at the end of it. And so once you see a really, really complex project like that has a big budget, that has 100 moving parts, that has dozens of people involved, you start to become much more systematic in your thinking. And then once I started writing my books, that's when I really had to get on it. And after I wrote my books, Notion came out. All these various note-taking tools have come out that have really kind of, I think this last year or two has been this just dramatic evolution in the entire concept of note-taking and note-taking apps, and all-in-one workspaces, where one of my old business partners used to say, as content becomes more infinite, curation becomes much more valuable, which is in a lot of ways where you guys come in, because there's no end to content, and it's not going to stop tomorrow. Tomorrow there will be new stuff to consume, new stuff that you might discover. And so I think that whole idea that, as content becomes more infinite, curation becomes more valuable, is no longer something that people are just applying to content, but it's happening with the tools we use too. That's why you have Notion as an all-in-one workspace, or tools like Mem, or tools like Roam. And so you're not having to context shift. That's the other thing, is that I realized the ability to focus for an extended period of time was going to be instrumental to this, and systems had to be a part of that. Because if you're trying to write a book and you are stupid enough to tell your editor you can finish it in 6 months, like I did, then you have to basically work every day. And not only that, writing a 45,000 word manuscript is not the same as writing 1,000 words a day, because 1,000 words a day, it doesn't matter if any of it is good, because most of it isn't 90% of the time. So that's why I always say, like, 90% of everything I create is complete garbage, and 10% is the stuff I risk sharing with my audience.
So when you think about like the areas that you focused on kind of broadly, like if I'm a creative or creator who's starting to think about actually scaling my business, I've maybe got a few successful kind of like blogs or some other outlets. Maybe I'm starting to think about hiring people. Like, what are some of those areas that you need to be thinking about early, as opposed to dealing with them when they become a problem?
Yeah, I think the big one is process, right? So there's a guy named Victor Chang who wrote a book called Extreme Revenue Growth. And I personally think everybody should read that book, whether they're trying to build a startup or just a small business, because one of the things he talks about is when he goes into a startup, the first thing that he has any founder do is document the process for every single task that they complete on a regular basis, whether that's sending invoices, whether that's customer onboarding. And why do you do that? Well, it's fine when you're dealing with 2 or 3 people. The problem is that once you get to 25, 30, 40, 50 people, if you don't have that process in place, what ends up ensuing is chaos. And inevitably, that structure is going to break. Sam Altman, the president of Y Combinator, said right around 25 employees is structure breaks, because the beginning, you don't want too much structure. You need the freedom to be able to play, to explore, to do that. But at some point, like right now, we produce 2 podcasts a week. I write a blog post. I talk to you, I have you as a client who I advise. So once you start taking on multiple projects, to be able to keep all that stuff straight in your head, for example, somebody mentioned that the webinar was at 2 p.m. I actually have an interview at 3 p.m. and I told the guys, like, hey, sorry, I have to cancel. And that's an example of systems gone wrong and process gone wrong. And that's why I'm saying, like, even I am far from perfect at this. But I think that's where it has to start, is looking at what is the process and why do we do this? Why do you create a checklist? Well, something as simple as a checklist can help you avoid a lot of errors. There's another book called The Checklist Manifesto that was written by Atul Gawande, who is a New York Times bestselling author and a surgeon. And one of the things they found is in the process of using checklists in hospitals, they were able to reduce, things that went wrong during surgery, infection rates, all of that. It's kind of like getting on an airplane. If you've ever been on a flight that has been delayed by 15 or 20 minutes and you're sitting on the tarmac, there's one reason. It's because they didn't pass the pre-flight checklist. And the reason they have that checklist is because they want to get you to where you're going alive. And if they don't have that checklist, it's really risky. And the funny thing is, we can take that process where the stakes aren't as high and we can apply it to our work. And not only that, when you have a process that's documented, let's just take publishing a blog post as an example, right? Most of the process for publishing a blog post is repetitive. You publish it in WordPress or whatever your CMS is, you add links, you add images. Now, if you have to store that information in your brain, you're basically wasting your most valuable cognitive bandwidth on really low quality activities, as opposed to having that bandwidth for real valuable creative thinking, because you can't store all this information in your brain and have room to have creative thinking. David Allen says that your brain is not a hard drive, or that your brain is for having ideas, not for storing them. And the problem is that when you're storing things like process in your brain, not only are you wasting the hard drive space, if you like the metaphor, if you like to speak, but you are also trying to remember a process and you're much more likely to make errors. I know this because it happens to me too. Like if I follow a checklist every time I publish a blog post, literally it's like, is this done? Is this done? Is this done? And it takes the time down from, a matter of minutes. And funny enough, you might be able to be faster by not using a checklist. You'll be 1,000 times more accurate. For example, the example that somebody pointed out of me saying 2 p.m. I don't know how that got in the email. It was somewhere in one of the places I wrote it, and I thought, wait a minute. I thought, then that's an example of not thoroughly checking everything off. And so when you have checklists for all these things, the other piece of this is automation, but I think that's a more advanced conversation. We can get there, but I think that is where I would start, is to say, okay, what are my day-to-day tasks that are repetitive, that are important, and that require the same steps over and over again, and how do I document those steps somewhere? There's a tool called Process Street that basically is designed for this exact purpose, where it's just checklists. Because I think that most of us, if you've ever worked at a big company, you go in and there's all this paperwork, all this stuff. It just seems like a bunch of bureaucratic bullshit. And the reason for that is that without all that bureaucratic nonsense, it's hard to scale. Because imagine if you have no process and you hire 200 employees, if you don't have a consistent process for how to onboard, how to take care of their health insurance, all that stuff. If you don't have a consistent process, every time somebody comes in, the HR person is going to be pulling their hair out, and multiply that to the point where you're the size of Google, and you're not going to be the size of Google. So Yeah, I think the way to sum this up is something Keith Rabois said, and he was quoting Warren Buffett, is he said, build a company that idiots can run because eventually they will, and assume you're the biggest idiot of all, in which in my case, that's the assumption I make is, okay, make this idiot proof and assume I'm the idiot who's going to cause all the problems here. Because anytime you break a system or have a bottleneck, it's almost always the person who designs the system that is the cause of that problem.
That's actually a really great point, because as you were talking about that, I was thinking one of the unique challenges specifically for creatives and creative entrepreneurs is you have always been kind of like the sole employee of your business for a very long time. You create, you distribute, you do all the administration, you kind of do every job possible. And then at a certain point, if you want to scale, you have to, start to delegate things. And, in our previous conversations, I think you talked a little bit about how kind of unraveling these processes and writing them down helped you realize like where you can delegate and where you need to spend your time. So could you talk a little bit about how you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, yes, I'll put together a list of books I've mentioned. I've had like 10 people ask me for book lists, so I need to create just one comprehensive one. As far as delegation goes, there's an exercise that I found out about. There's an article called, I think it was either on Entrepreneur or Forbes, called "This is Your Path to the $1,000 an Hour Mindset." And this article really fundamentally, made me think about this very differently. So first off, you want to think about what your time is worth. And Naval Ravikant, and his podcast on How to Get Rich, said just assume your time is worth $5,000 an hour, even if it's not. That even though that might sound ludicrous, because at some point it will be ideally, because then you will start to think like a person whose time is worth $5,000 an hour. So, people are like, oh, billionaires are obnoxious because they fly in private jets. Well, when your time is worth that much money, if you have to stand in line at TSA, you're not losing time, you're losing a shitload of money, potentially millions of dollars by standing in line for 5 minutes. And so as a result, they delegate stupid things like that. They fly in private jets because they don't have to deal with all that nonsense. It's actually not just, hey, let me show off my wealth. Granted, that's probably a nice part of it too, but still. But the idea was really simple. This guy said, at the end of every week, create a series of 3 columns and label each column $10 an hour tasks, $100 an hour tasks, $1,000 an hour tasks. Then basically go in and put what you did and which one falls into each category. So for example, for me, giving a speech is a $1,000 an hour task, or even a $5,000 an hour task, depending on who I'm speaking to. Sending an email or trying to coordinate schedules with somebody is a $10 an hour task, even though I do still do some of that. And this is, but the idea is bit by bit, you want to start identifying what are $10 an hour tasks and eventually figure out a plan to outsource them. So for example, now when I write a blog post, I finish editing it and I hand it off to a virtual assistant. She adds all the links, she adds images, she sets it up to be published on WordPress, and then I go in and I do the SEO stuff because she doesn't know how to do that. But once I have somebody else doing that as well, in an ideal world, you want to look at this as what is the one thing that you need to do in this process that nobody else can do? That's your $100 or $1,000 an hour task. And usually that's no more than 1 or 2 things. So the podcast is a good example, right? For producing the podcast, there's only one thing that I can do that nobody else can do with me, and that's the interview. Everything else, from setting it up, to be published, to designing the cover art, to writing a description of the show, to doing shows, all of that can be done by somebody else. I don't need to be the one doing all of those things. I still choose my own guests because that is a big deal to me. I don't outsource that mainly because I don't like the idea of somebody controlling my editorial. And that's the reason we have such interesting guests, I think, is because I follow my curiosity. There are exceptions to that. Some people, completely outsource it. I personally think that's nonsense, but that's just an opinion. So, I think that's the key, is to look at, what are your $10 an hour tasks? What are your $100 an hour tasks? And what are your $1,000 an hour tasks? And, you're not going to be able to necessarily get rid of everything right away, but knowing what they are is a good starting point. And then once you figure out what those $10 an hour tasks are, you go back to the previous thing we were talking about, start to document the process for them. Because, I mentioned checklists. Another thing you can do is create Loom videos, which is actually way better than checklists. Like, a video is worth 1,000 words because you literally show people exactly what you're talking about. I try not to do as much communication and writing, especially if I need somebody to see something or how something is done. because otherwise it's really confusing. They're trying to decipher what you're talking about without being able to see it. Whereas if you can just show them in a Loom video, they know exactly what you're talking about. Then that could range from anything to it's like, hey, here's how you set up a blog post, that kind of stuff. So we try to create videos for everything. And one way to do this is every time you run across a process that has a glitch in it, start to think, okay, how do I document this? Again, I think a lot of people like this idea of a system being set it and forget it. And unfortunately, it's more set it and keep an eye on it and notice that it evolves. And it's also going to break, especially as you start to automate things will fall apart. And almost always it's human error that causes things to fall apart.
Yeah, I can definitely attest to that. Having set up a bunch of automations myself using tools like Zapier, they definitely do break and you do have to keep an eye on them. So our systems aren't perfect, but I think just the taking the initiative to set them up, I think already teaches you so much. Figuring out those $1,000 tasks. I think I started thinking like that after we had that conversation, and it helps give you clarity on, I think back to your book, like what makes you unmistakable. Like the things that make you unmistakable are the things that are your $1,000, $5,000 tasks, and everything else is just part of the process to get you to that moment.
Yeah.
We are running a little bit behind, and I know that everyone's probably really excited to hear about these 5 specific pillars that you've identified for building that scalable content business. So Srini, what are these 5 pillars, and could you tell us a little bit about each one of them?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is we've kind of been talking, about all of them, as we've been, going through this. But, the big one, the first one is obviously focus. You're like living in a world full of distractions, and you have to be able to focus for some extended period of time to move things forward. And that's going to be different, in terms of what your brain is like, what you're working like. What you need to do is become sort of an observer of your own behavior. Jim Collins, I think, had that whole idea of Jim the Hedgehog, and he basically noticed what is adding meaning, what is driving me crazy. That's a big one. Is focus. I think the other, I think the big one is systems, right? Without systems, you're kind of shooting in the dark. And every time you don't have systems, it's kind of one of those things where, like we talked about, you're just blowing your cognitive bandwidth on pointless and meaningless activities. And you need systems for idea capture, you need systems for content creation, you need systems for just about everything. Give me just a sec here, I'm going to pull these up. And that's the thing. At a certain point, what happens is a lot of this knowledge becomes unconscious because you don't have to think about it anymore. So that's why literally I'm having to pull this up, because it's so second nature at this point that you don't think too much about it. But the next big one, right, is habits. James Clear said that habits are the compound interest of self-improvement. And I think that is true for creative work as well. So your creative habits are the compound interest of a successful creative business or creative career, because you'll start with one habit. For me, that was 1,000 words a day. And that keystone habit creates a ripple effect into every other area of your life. So I went from 1,000 words a day to meditating for 10 minutes a day to reading, anywhere between 50 to 100 pages every day, to all of that. So that's, another big one is your habits. And then let me look at the other one. So I think the really other big one here, especially in our world now, and this is very relevant to Charli, is knowledge management, personal knowledge management, professional knowledge management. Because the thing is, if you consume all of this information, but you don't do anything with it, it's no better than not having consumed the information at all. It's like the person who reads a book about how to diet and goes out and eats ice cream and pizza the next day. It's like, well, then what was the point of reading a book about the diet? You didn't actually do anything with it. And the way to do something with that is knowledge management. And knowledge management, in a lot of ways, is kind of an overlying sort of, umbrella that kind of, it's like I don't know what you call the top of an umbrella, but it's kind of the top of all of this, because everything else stems from your ability to manage your knowledge. And, in a world full of noise, if you don't have the ability to decipher, what's relevant from what's not, the signal from the noise, you're just going to feel completely overwhelmed and be dealing with information overload. And, part of that comes down to being mindful about how you consume content. And your knowledge management systems actually enable you to be much more mindful about how you consume content. Because what you get from personal knowledge management is the ability to externalize information, as we talked about before. So you're not storing all this stuff in your brain, and you don't want to store that stuff in your brain, because once you externalize, whatever it is, notes from books, tasks, whatever, now you have the space in your brain to make connections between ideas, to really think creatively, to synthesize. And, once you can synthesize all of that, you can actually use that to create. So you actually become much more prolific as a result. So like if I wanted to, I could publish every day. I don't, because the quality will suffer, but that's the thing that you end up getting. And all this ties together really into systems. And then finally, the last piece of this really is automation. And our automation capabilities are getting really, really good. It's just a matter of automation, takes us all the way back to what we were talking about before, which is documenting process. So I have a friend who runs a really successful company called Gap Consulting, where he teaches companies how to use Airtable to automate complex processes, and he saves them fortunes. And he built that business. I think he started building about 3 years ago. They're on track to do $1 million in revenue this year. And one of the things that he tells me is that even the biggest companies, half the battle is that most people don't know their process. And for a while, he would sit there and help them figure it out. Now he just charges them for it. He says, fine, your process will help you figure it out, but we're not going to do that for free anymore. Because when you automate a lot of these things, so for example, when we book a podcast guest, there's sort of a workflow to it. They can pitch us, which goes into an Airtable form. I can send them a note, which basically is with a Calendly link. All of that goes into Airtable, and we know when an episode is scheduled. We know what the dates are. Our illustrator, uploads album covers. So all of it is stored in a database. So that entire process of contacting somebody, booking an interview, sending them a Zencastr link, all of that is done through automation. Now imagine having to do all of that manually. When we built this, my process for managing all this went from 10 hours a week to like 10 minutes a week. Mostly it's literally just only because Zencastr is stupid and doesn't have a Zapier integration. If that was done, then I wouldn't even have to do that. But almost all of it is fully automated, because there's you want to think about this in terms of this entire interdependent system that frees you up. I think that the way you want to think about this is that you're building a factory, and all these things that we're talking about are part of the assembly line in that factory. And you're sort of the foreman or the CEO of the factory, and your job is to make sure the assembly line leads to some sort of output. So all this stuff is raw materials, labor, input. So in the Industrial Revolution, you had raw materials and labor. Let's say we're just making shoes, for example. We have shoelaces, we have leather, we have somebody who paints the shoes. So you have a combination of that. In the digital economy or the knowledge economy, your labor is actually split between humans and technology. So Charli, is a good example of this. Charli basically becomes your assistant to go and organize your content. So you're not sitting here sifting through files, and that's a form of labor that is, basically technology being transformed into labor. That's the big differentiator between the Industrial Revolution and now, is that you're using a combination of human and technological labor to increase output. And as we evolve, that's going to be more and more the case, I think.
That's a good way to put it. So I have some kind of rapid fire follow-ups on the 5 pillars. So the first one is, if you could just give one piece of advice on habits and managing attention. I know that this is a huge topic, and it's one of those where it can feel like it's an easier said than done type of topic. But if there's one thing that's worked for you personally, or one thing that's worked for some folks in your community, if you could share that would be great.
Yeah, for sure. So we have a concept called the minimum viable action, which is the smallest possible thing you could do to create some sort of inertia. So people will often come to me and say, okay, how do I write 1,000 words a day? And I tell them, don't try to write 1,000 words a day. Start by sitting down at your desk and picking up a pen. And if that's all you do, consider that a victory. And that sounds ridiculous on the surface, but if you do that for 6 or 7 days in a row, you sit down at your desk and pick up a pen every day, you think to yourself, well, hell, I'm sitting here every day. I might as well write something down. And then, that becomes one sentence, and that becomes a paragraph, that becomes, pages. James Clear, who wrote Atomic Habits, had a reader who used this approach to go to the gym, and he would just drive to the gym, and then he wouldn't even go in. And once he started driving to the gym, he would go in for a little bit, because what's happening is you're creating the identity of the person who has the habit you want to develop. And as a result, this person lost 100 pounds. So that's really what it is. It's about starting small. That's the one thing I would say.
Yeah. I'm gonna try that gym one. That sounds like a good one for me to try. Okay. So automation tools, there's a ton of them out there, and we need them, but how do you pick the right automation tools? Do you have a method for choosing them, or is it just, from your friends, like whatever you hear is good?
So I'm notorious for, having way too many things. My accountant yells at me all the time. It's like, what the hell is up with all these SaaS services? I think it's largely based on what your own personal workflow is, like how does your work, right? So we talked about the podcast. Airtable for me was perfect. I didn't realize it could do all of that, until my friend came along, because most people use it as a glorified spreadsheet when it's really not. So that's, one thing is to think about what is it that you're trying to accomplish, and does this tool actually help you accomplish that? Or are you just adding more work for yourself by having these tools? Because I'm as notorious as anybody for having the same thing in multiple tools. It's like, wait a minute, why are we using these tools? Like recently, I'm primarily doing my writing inside of Mem, because even the notifications in Notion are distracting, and I'm not going to add my team to Mem because I just want to keep that for myself. That's my knowledge base because of the bidirectional linking capabilities. But it also is cool because you can, very easily put content into any other tool from Mem. So that's one thing. I think it's really about what is your workflow, and does this tool actually facilitate what you're trying to accomplish, or does it impede what you're trying to accomplish?
That's
So
awesome.
I think you want to start with the end in mind is what I would say.
Yeah, I think that's great advice too, because one of the things I was thinking about is, you're someone who's pretty comfortable with trying a lot of software tools and technology in general. And I think there's probably a lot of people out there who aren't. And so I think it is just about
my approach is
understanding
actually
yourself.
totally, and I would not recommend the way I do this to most people. This is one of those do as I say, don't do as I do things. Like the less that you have to deal with, the better,
Yeah.
because the thing is, then you just unnecessarily start adding like, endless amounts of SaaS services and expenses. Like I do this because I have a community where I, share information, and I do it out of morbid curiosity, but it does get problematic at times.
Yeah. So also learning when to like prune something, like this is not serving me, get rid of it.
Yeah.
All right. 3 rapid fire questions before we jump to audience Q&A. What are your kind of like top 3 or 4 tools that you're using right now that you're loving?
Yeah. Mem is probably the biggest one that I absolutely love. I mean, I created a YouTube channel with Mem tutorials that, if you just do Unmistakable Creative Life or whatever on Mem. I did a webinar for them recently titled How to Build an Idea Factory Using Mem. That's a big one. Readwise, which allows you to take book notes from physical books just by taking photographs of them. Because if you do, like I read physical books only, and it's a pain to get your notes out of them, because I thought, I would have to type up all my notes, from each book. Now, thanks to Readwise, I can just basically take a picture of it and add it. And then the one that comes to mind most recently is a tool called Notive, Notiv. And Notive allows you to it logs into your Zoom meeting, and it automatically transcribes the meeting, and it gives you a list of recommended action items. There are a few tools that have done this. Notive was the one that I saw that did it best so far. Like it basically, so you can create a link to that note and to that meeting, and on the sidebar, it'll have, the highlights of the meeting, actions from that meeting, whatever. So I think that is probably, those are the 3 that come to mind.
Awesome. Your favorite creator that you've, maybe spoken to recently or maybe not spoken to recently, and why?
There's a creator that I want to speak to. You probably know who he is. Everybody here may not, and that's A.R. Rahman. He's an Indian composer. He is like by far, I think as far as artist, he's the definition of unmistakable in my mind, because you can hear an A.R. Rahman track and you're like, oh, that's A.R. Rahman. Like that's a really difficult thing to accomplish with music. And his biographer said this guy literally defines the phrase music has no language. Like I can't understand, I don't speak Hindi, so I don't understand any of the words in his music, and I still really like it. And I think that says a lot. And after reading his biography, like the work ethic, he's like the go-to guy in India for anything music related. And his philosophy and all of it is so brilliant, because I think he never has seen himself as this like, amazing musician. There's a documentary about him on Netflix called Harmony, where he goes around India and he meets with all these different musicians. And the humility at which he goes to them with is remarkable. He's there as a student, not as a teacher. And it's like, you're A.R. Rahman, like you're the icon. But so I think that he's like my dream interview at the moment. Like if I could interview anybody, it would be A.R. Rahman.
I mean, if I can help start like some sort of petition to get A.R. Rahman on your podcast, I'm certainly willing to put in the effort, because I really love his music. And I mean, I do understand Hindi, so I can understand what he says, but like, yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah.
Okay, last one. Best advice you've gotten on being a creative entrepreneur ever?
No, and this is not the most inspiring advice, but my mentor, Greg, he said, too often people are focused on the possibility of what they can accomplish and they ignore the probability that they'll accomplish that. So people go and try to do things where they have no natural advantages. He said, so if you want to build a successful startup, go work at Google first. Your odds of being successful are going to be much higher. I mean, and it's not a coincidence that a lot of the most successful startup founders are all Google alumni, because we don't think about that, right? Like, what's the probability that I'm going to become LeBron James or play in the NBA? Zero. I'm a scrawny Indian person. No matter how passionate I am about basketball, that's never going to happen. And that's part of the problem I think we have in this world of sort of self-improvement. We don't consider talent, intelligence, and ability. And those things play a role. They matter. Like if you're born Michael Phelps and you have massive, arms and an unusual lung capacity, you're probably going to win an Olympic swimming team. But like if you and I decided to try out for an Olympic event, all things that we're not going to make. We're Indian, like we're already screwed. We don't have any natural athletic ability. That's our biggest genetic disadvantage. So that's what that is the best advice I've probably ever gotten is, and that's hard advice to hear for a lot of people. They don't want to admit that.
No, that's so important. Play to your strengths. Don't set yourself up for unfair advantage. Yeah, like most sports, I would never put myself in the situation where I'm trying to kill myself, trying to be the #1 tennis player. I will stick to, cricket or field hockey or something, or there's some lineage. Well, thank you so much, Srini. This was a really amazing conversation. I always feel really energized after speaking to you. And I think probably
I wish my mom said that. my mom is like, my mother said that it'd be amazing. But
I'll give her a call. But yeah, no, this has been a great conversation. I think this is all great advice for other creators out there who are really trying to turn that. Maybe it's a side hustle right now. Maybe it's just something that they've been wanting to do for a long time. I think some of the advice you gave today will definitely give people the energy they need to take that next step. I think the one question we did have was, getting that books that you recommended. Yep. So if you want to shoot that over to me, I will put it in the email along with the recording, so everyone has access to this later. And if there are no other questions, I think we can get back to the rest of our day.
Awesome.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Talk to you later. Bye.